last person who heard this story never slept peacefully again. Sarah had just started her shift at St. Margaret's Hospital, an old facility on the outskirts of town that was more or less forgotten by the public. The hospital had been around for over a century, its grand architecture now showing signs of neglect. The floors creaked beneath her feet, and the long, dimly lit hallways seemed to echo with the weight of its past. Most of the building was abandoned, but a few sections still saw patients, though they were few and far between. Sarah had taken the job as a night nurse, hoping the quiet pace would suit her. At first, everything felt normal. Her nights were filled with routine, checking on patients, administering medication, making notes. But soon, Sarah started noticing things that didn't quite add up. The first incident seemed harmless enough. One morning, after a particularly exhausting shift, Sarah returned to her small, sterile room, only to find the chair by the window had been moved several feet from its usual spot. She thought nothing of it, assuming she had forgotten, maybe left it there in a hurry the night before. The second occurrence was a little stranger. A faint whisper, barely audible, seemed to call her name late one night. Sarah. It came from the hallway outside her room, but when she opened the door, there was no one there. It could have been the wind, or maybe someone in another room talking, she rationalized. Still, the unease gnawed at her. As the days passed, the disturbances grew more frequent. The whispers became louder, and Sarah began to hear them even when she was alone in the empty wards. At times, she'd glance in the mirrors and swear she saw fleeting shadows moving just out of sight. And then there were the patients, the ones who had passed away in the hospital over the years. Their faces would sometimes appear at the edges of her vision, staring at her from doorways or lying in beds where no one should have been. They weren't there, of course, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. It wasn't until Sarah found herself alone on a particularly quiet night, her shift stretching long into the morning, that the terror truly began. As she walked down a dark hallway, her footsteps muffled on the worn floors, she heard a voice again. This time, it was clearer. "Help us." The voice was desperate, filled with an aching sadness. It seemed to come from one of the patient rooms. She stepped toward the door, her heart pounding, and opened it slowly. The room was empty, but something was off. The air felt thick, oppressive. The faint smell of antiseptic was replaced by something older, more musty. Sarah's eyes locked on the corner of the room where she thought she saw something move. A pale figure, barely visible in the dim light. But when she blinked, it was gone. She backed out of the room, her hands trembling. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Sarah couldn't ignore her growing sense of dread. She decided to look into the hospital's history. In the hospital's archives, she uncovered old records detailing the tragic past of St. Margaret's. Decades ago, the hospital had been the site of unethical experiments. Patients, many of them vulnerable and with no families to advocate for them, were subjected to horrific procedures in the name of medical advancement. The records were filled with names of patients who had died under mysterious circumstances, their fates forgotten by time. As Sarah pieced together the story, a terrible realization hit her. The whispers, the shadows, the haunting faces, they weren't just random hauntings. They were the spirits of those patients, trapped in the hospital, unable to move on because they had been mistreated, their suffering ignored. They had died, not just from illness or injury, but from the cruel, inhumane practices of those entrusted to care for them. Determined to help them, Sarah began communicating with the spirits. She spent hours each night trying to decipher the messages they sent her, fragments of their pain and fear. In time, she learned their stories. The young woman who had died in an experimental surgery, the elderly man who had been left to rot in a forgotten corner of the ward, the child whose life was cut short by a drug trial. Each had been failed by the system, and now they wandered the halls, seeking justice. Sarah helped them tell their stories, spoke their names aloud, and brought their suffering to light. As she did, the spirits grew more peaceful, their presence less oppressive, and on the night she finally shared the truth with the world, the whispers stopped. The hospital closed its doors for good not long after, but Sarah's heart still aches when she remembers those lost souls. They had not been seeking to harm, but to be remembered, and in the end, that's all they had ever wanted, to be seen, to be heard, and to be understood. Hit subscribe and don't dare miss what's coming next. Or the next scream you hear might be your own.